When Sorcerer Supreme Meets Kid. Written by yellowsunflowerheart and read by Eleanor Elizabeth. Summary. I don't dislike you, Peter. I just don't know what to do with children. Well, I don't really know what to do with the Sorcerer Supreme either, so I guess that makes two of us. Or, Stephen was as afraid of Peter as Peter was of Stephen, and Tony had a plan to force them to bond. Chapter 1. Peter stepped forward and knocked on the giant door of the Sanctum. It looked old and solid. Peter bet it would crush him in an instant if it was to fall right now. Why his brain offered him these terrifying unnecessary facts, he didn't know, but God, he wished he could turn them off. The right door shifted suddenly, and with a tired moan, hauled open just a crack. The door knocker rattled against the thick slab, but otherwise there wasn't a sound to be heard, aside from the distant street traffic. Peter called out once, twice, before he hesitantly reached out and carefully pulled the door back a little more, enough so that he could see inside. No one stood across from him, he noticed first. It was dead empty. Just a grand foyer with ceilings that must be at least 3 stories tall, and old checked tiles on the floor that reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen when he was a child. He hadn't realized he'd taken the steps, but suddenly he was in the center of the room. Mr. Stark had told him about this place a couple of times, but Peter hadn't yet seen it for himself. It wasn't much, yet still, it somehow took his breath away. The sheer expanse of this place deceiving from the street. Peter could shoot webs and fly through here. His thoughts were cut off by the heavy door closing itself, and suddenly he found himself swallowing hard. Nothing to fear, just a door that opens and closes itself. He's seen scarier things. He supposes he should have suspected as much from a house of magic. Peter wasn't exactly sure what to expect. Magical creatures scared in the shadows? Door maids and servants, floating objects and talking photographs on the wall. He probably shouldn't have done that Harry Potter marathon first thing when he got back after the snap reversal. He was fairly certain Dr. Strange would not approve of his assumptions. Mr. Stark? Peter called out. Tony had told him to meet him there around 4. He'd text the kid just after school, giving him a time and an address, as well as directions to a restaurant and the number to a prepaid order. It was a little out of his way, closer to the hospital, but he didn't mind stretching his arms with a few webs on his way there and back, heading for the Sanctum. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and already figuring it was Tony, Peter answered without checking the caller ID. Hey, Mr. Stark. Hey, kid. Did you get the order I made? Yeah. Why did I have to go all the way out here? Wasn't there a restaurant closer? I'm a bit late. Well, since that's Gandalf's favorite, and I didn't tell him you were coming, I thought it might butter him up a bit. You didn't tell him I was coming? Peter frowned. Mr. Stark. Peter? The Spider-Man whirled around to find a tall man stood at the top of the grand staircase. Stephen looked completely casual, dressed in a long-sleeve mid-grey sweater and a pair of light grey sweatpants. His hair was still brushed away from his face, though more loosely, perhaps with his fingers this time. His socks did actually match, and for the first time ever, Peter noticed his hands were on full display. The only evident sign that the man was the Sorcerer Supreme was the red cloak that hovered just a little far behind, keeping its distance, though clearly curious. It did little to ease Peter's nerves. It wasn't that he was scared of Stephen, or that he didn't like the man. It was that he was fairly certain that Stephen didn't like him. In fact, Pete would put money on a bet that Stephen considered him annoying. Probably would have left him on Titan or that spacecraft, if it wasn't for Tony. Sir, Dr. Strange, sir. What are you doing here? The sorcerer questioned, beginning to descend the stairs. How'd you get in? The door? Peter pointed. The door just, when I knocked it opened, so I just... Sorry, it was rude. I should have just waited outside. Are you in trouble? Stephen ignored the rambling, and he looked him up and down when he was close enough. Are you hurt? No. Mr. Stark told me to meet you here. 4 o'clock. I brought the food." Peter held up a small paper bag, almost as though it was a peace offering. Stephen's eyes fluttered over it, a gentle furrow on his brow, and for a second it had Peter questioning himself too. "You just walked right through." Peter heard the hint of confusion in Stephen's usually unreadable tone. "You just knocked, and the door—" "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do anything wrong. I thought someone must have been on the other side." "No, you didn't do any. Did Tony tell you why you're here?" "No." Peter shook his head. "I figured you guys were working on something and he would let me come help. He's on the phone with me right now." Stephen took the mobile and held it to his head, turning his back on Pete and separating them with a few more steps. It wasn't any use. Peter's advanced hearing allowed him to hear every hushed word of Stephen's conversation with Tony. "Why is the kid standing in my foyer?" the sorcerer demanded. "Merlin," Tony sang. Let's say I'm out of the country, and I thought, since you two have nothing better to do, maybe you might hang out with him for a while, have some quality bonding time." "We don't need quality bonding time, Tony." "Yes, you do. The two of you can barely look at each other without freaking out." "What does that matter?" Stephen's voice dropped lower. "I told you, I'm not interested in being part of your little club." First of all, it's not a club, and secondly, technically it's Fury's club." "I have better things to do." "No, you don't." Tony cut him off. "Spend some time with the kid, put a movie on, eat, show him a magic trick. I don't care. Just make sure he knows he can go to you for help when I'm not there. Got it? I can't have him afraid to talk to you. It defeats the purpose of you being the Sorcerer Supreme." Stephen couldn't argue with that, and neither could Peter. He wasn't afraid to go to Stephen for help. It was just that he was pretty sure that Stephen thought everything he did was a burden. He sensed that Stephen felt like there were far better things to do than chase after Pete, and that's what Pete felt like. A chore. Stephen thought he was just a useless kid they had to childmind on mission. Under different circumstances, spending time with the sorcerer might be nice. Stephen was as intelligent as Tony. Standing there in the middle of the sanctum, it took everything Peter had not to start firing questions, soaking in all the knowledge that Stephen had. It might be nice to know the sorcerer the same way he knew Tony, but he didn't want to stay if Stephen didn't want the same. He didn't want the man to be forced into this. If Peter was really honest, though, he wanted Stephen to want him. He just wouldn't say it out loud to anyone. Peter could cope without. Was, in fact, very, very used to getting by without people. He still hadn't figured out yet how to not want them. It stung every time Stephen ignored him in favour of someone else. To be a little self-centred, Peter was smarter than plenty of the Avengers. Stephen's knowledge would be far more beneficial if he shared it with the Spider-Man. He just didn't know how to say so without sounding stuck up and whiny. "Call me next time," Stephen muttered. "Before you send him? I'm not even wearing proper pants." "You're right, I'm sorry." Tony apologized after a missed beat. "I just want... He needs another man he can trust, Stephen. And I want that to be you. Because I trust you. And I trust you with him." "All he ever has to do is call, Tony. I got him." "You better have sent him with good food. And if he ends up liking me more than you, I don't want to hear it." Tony let out an amused snort, and Peter barely held his own back. "I brought you good food." Peter could picture Tony's eyes rolling. "And as if you could ever replace me." "We'll see." Stephen was actually smirking when he turned back to Peter. Mobile passed back without another word. Stephen took the bag of food instead, and gave Pete a few paces of privacy to say his goodbyes. "You shouldn't have tricked him." "I didn't," Tony defended. "I tricked you. Don't let him fool you. He adores you. Make sure you pick the movie. I guarantee he has awful taste." "I'm gonna hang up now." "Have fun, alright?" "Bye, Mr. Stark." Stephen led Peter up the stairs without another word. He looked lighter now, and his relaxed shoulders made Peter's follow suit. He didn't feel so intrusive anymore. Stephen wasn't thrilled to have him there, but at least Peter knew now that the man didn't dislike his presence exactly. He just felt a little exposed. and that Peter understood perfectly. When Tony had shown up in his apartment that first time, Peter felt vulnerable. It was scary to have a stranger in a place so personal to you, especially when that stranger was from a completely different world. Peter could admit that maybe he jumped to conclusions a little too soon with Stephen. There were a number of reasons for the sorcerer to behave that wasn't a hatred for Peter Parker. He'd barely spent any time with the man. He could be incredibly kind for all Peter knew, and he'd just painted him as some child-hating asshole. He probably wasn't even that bad. He was a doctor, after all. Or that's what Peter thinks Tony meant when he gave Peter the Doctor Strange rundown that day. It was hard to understand Tony sometimes. His need to add sarcastic little quips and his opinions between every fact made for very confusing lectures sometimes. Peter felt a little guilty for his assumptions. How scary can a man who wears sweatpants and oversized jumpers and talks to a magical cloak be? Truly, Stephen actually had a fair likeness to Mr. Stark when you stopped and paid attention. So, why did Peter assume the worst of the sorcerer, but felt so enamoured with Tony? The wonder kept Peter distracted until they'd reached what he assumed was the living room, and Peter had something else to analyse. The lounge looked like any other. There were no evident signs that it was resided by sorcerers. Well, at least it didn't resemble Hogwarts, Peter corrected. There was a big couch, cushions on the floor, the television wasn't oversized. Peter couldn't help but think it looked like a family room. And that was maybe the most unexpected detail. Peter certainly couldn't imagine Stephen at a social movie night. Stop making assumptions. Stephen placed a bag of food on the coffee table and encouraged Peter to make himself comfortable as he went to find some cutlery. Peter considered staying close to the exit, but he didn't want to look like he'd planned an escape route, and Doctor Strange wouldn't exactly hurt him. So, with a calming breath, he made his way to the other side of the couch. He set his big bag down and sat on the floor beside it. When Stephen returned, he conjured fire and sat cross-legged on the floor in the small space between the couch and the coffee table. It seemed practiced, yet still, it looked stiff as he set out the forks and began to unpack their meal. With a nod, the man invited Pete to join him, and since the sorcerer seemed far less threatening on the ground, Peter let himself mirror the position, desperate for something to say to break the ice. I didn't know you were vegan. Peter couldn't think of any other starter. Are you? Stephen looked at him only briefly. Peter didn't get the chance to stutter out an answer. The cloak suddenly tickled at the tips of his ears, and it settled heavy on his shoulders. He supposed the weight made sense, since it hauled Stephen around, but it still shocked him. It looked so weightless the way it draped. Oddly, it was actually calming, having the cloak bear its weight on him. It felt warm and safe. And from the way Stephen kept side-eyeing it, Peter assumed there must have been a reason the relic had moved. He couldn't help but laugh as it began to massage his temples. It was so cute. Peter wanted to take out his phone and record a video for Ned and MJ. Neither of them would believe him when he FaceTimed them later on. If he wasn't on such thin ice with Doctor Strange, he would have asked if he could right now. He didn't want to send the wrong message, though, whether it be disinterest or childishness. He didn't want Doctor Strange to think that he couldn't keep anything private, or that he had an uncontrollable need to share everything with everyone. Cloak? The material seemed to respond to Stephen's strong call of its name, but it still didn't move from Peter's shoulders. We're eating. You know the rules. Peter could swear, even without the face, the cloak looked sad as it vacated his shoulders and banished itself to the corner, as though it was sulking. Stephen continued setting out the meal, placing containers neatly in front of Peter and encouraging him to start. Does it have a name? It doesn't exactly talk to me, Stephen muttered, reasoning. We should give it a name, Peter suggested. A nickname, like we have. Stephen seemed intrigued, and Peter was encouraged to continue. What's its official name? Cloak of Levitation. Okay, so how about... Why don't we shorten it to Levy? Levy? Yeah, Cloak is boring. He needs a real name. Cloak. How do you feel about Peter naming you Levy? The fabric seemed to perk up, and it turned round to face them once again. Its edges seemed to vibrate gently. Looks like a yes, Stephen hummed. Okay, Levy it is. You can come back and join us after we've finished eating. Levy put itself back in the corner, and Peter turned to the food that sat in front of him. He hadn't realised how hungry he was, but it smelt amazing, and he was getting a little cool with the afternoon. He was looking forward to a little warmth. For the next few moments, the two of them sat in silence, getting themselves comfortable, before Stephen spoke up suddenly. I don't dislike you, Peter. I just don't know what to do with children. Well, I don't really know what to do with a Sorcerer Supreme either, so I guess that makes two of us, Peter smiled shyly. To his shock, Stephen returned it. What are we watching? We could watch something old, Peter suggested. I mean, not that you're old, obviously. I didn't mean it like that. I just meant something I might have watched when I was your age. Stephen eased him. It's okay. It was a while ago. Don't worry, this isn't Hogwarts. We have Netflix. No compromises necessary. Peter chuckled, and he felt himself relax further. It was like now that they'd voiced aloud just how they felt. It wasn't the elephant in the room anymore. They weren't treading carefully to keep the secret. They were both uncomfortable, and that was okay. They were both stuck in this together, and since Tony had brought them this beautiful food, they might as well enjoy it. I have one condition. No medical shows. Stephen shook his head, waking the TV. What? But yelling at the TV is therapeutic, Peter argued. I could claw my eyes out watching them prep for surgery. I'll watch absolutely anything else. Careful what you promise. Peter stole the remote with a wave of confidence. Within reason, Stephen corrected. Don't you dare try to pull some kids' cartoon crap on me. Peter couldn't hide the smile that crossed his lips. Stephen was fun, the same way bickering with Tony could be fun. He had never seen Stephen so undone and relaxed. Peter found himself chasing the reaction from the sorcerer. He wanted to make Stephen laugh, to purposefully wind him up. Peter suggested every bad show they scrolled by, sometimes reprimanded with a soft glare, other times a whack to the arm, or, at the suggestion of Chicago Med, a gentle smack up the backside of the head. They settled on a classic sometime later. Stephen had never seen Grease, and that simply wouldn't do. Who the hell hasn't seen Grease? Peter shrieked. I don't know. I just never got round to it. Honestly, it wasn't Peter's favourite, but it was a rite of passage. Everyone had to see it at least once in their lives. They weren't too focused on the movie anyway. Back and forth as they eat, they made small talk. Peter told Stephen he lived with his aunt, inquired whether the doctor actually lived in the Sanctum. Stephen wanted to know more about how Peter came to meet Tony, the Civil War as the media named it. They talked about the snow, other favourite movies of theirs. Peter asked about the specifics of Stephen's magic, and in turn, told him about his days of hiding web samples in the science classroom drawers. Peter had a plethora of questions about Levy, and how they found each other, how old it was, does it feel emotion or pain? The conversation slowly got easier, flowed better. They hardly touched anything personal, but all in time, Peter thought. He could bite back the questions about Stephen's scars, about the car accident he'd seen on the news all those years ago. Stephen seemed more comfortable with intellectual conversation. They strayed away from small talk, and they packed up the rubbish from dinner. They moved to the comfort of the couch instead, where Levy eagerly flew over to join its sorcerer. Stephen seemed to have relaxed more since their confessional, and they found their footing in the conversation. Peter started to test the limits he'd been awarded, with questions about Stephen's magic, and the battle techniques he'd used when they faced off against Thanos on Titan. Peter had paid attention to him then, not quite as lucky to have the means in their final battle. It had been glaringly obvious, however, that neither conflict had been the Doctor's first war. Stephen? Thanos wasn't your first, was he? The sorcerer's attention shifted across the couch to Peter. He had that usual shield up, the one that left him practically unreadable, though, after all this time, Peter was starting to notice there were signs of Stephen's confusion, just evident on the edges of his brows. It's just that... Peter shifted in his seat. Your hair was less grey before Thanos, and I noticed after you saved Tony, more of it lost its colour again. If it's like a consequence, then you must have used strong magic before. Stephen pondered the question for a while. Peter was starting to wonder if the sorcerer was just flat out ignoring him. The man didn't show any obvious sign of emotion, but then he was shifting, as though something under him had become uncomfortable. He turned a little more to face Peter and reached back to the bag on the coffee table. You have to try the brownies. I guarantee they're the best you've ever tasted. Peter nodded, choosing not to push the subject. His spidey senses were pretty sure Stephen would answer the question. It would just be on his own time, and Peter was okay with that. He had all the time in the world to wait anyway. He was halfway through his, admittedly delicious, brownies when Stephen did start to explain. I barely had the basics down. Peter froze and listened. We were under attack. I learnt on the job. Nearly died of an unfortunately located wound. Christine patched it up. And then I spent a small eternity dying, over and over, until my murder wasn't amusing anymore. That was amongst other things. But to answer your question, yes, that's why my hair has no colour. Magic always leaves a mark. Thank you for telling me. It felt stupid, but it also felt right. Peter wanted Stephen to know that he was grateful for his honesty, that he could trust Spider-Man too. Peter didn't want to be just a kid to the Avengers. He saw some traumatic things too. They needn't be afraid to discuss their own with him. Is there something you'd like to talk about? Stephen offered hesitantly. Not right now, no. But sometimes I feel like I'm going to burst if I don't. It's hard, because I don't want to put anyone in danger by telling them things. And I don't want Mr. Stark to only listen to me complain about the job, you know? I don't want him to think I'm ungrateful for his help, or too young to handle it, or, I don't know, whatever goes on in his head when I start talking. You can tell me. Stephen's words looked like they surprised them both. I know I'm not the most pleasant conversationalist, but I know what it's like to be the kid in the room of egotistical adults, and, unlike Tony, I know what it's like to be the new kid on the block. You're doing great, though, Peter. Thank you. It came out in a whisper. Sometimes I'm not so sure, you know? The mood in the room had changed. It was heavier, but not unpleasant. Stephen sat up a little higher and moved closer towards Peter. It was comforting. Peter knew the man was there, and it was enough. It was nice to talk to someone who was born in a completely different world too. Someone who didn't have the resources or connections, and was just thrown into the whirlpool the same way Peter had been. Stephen rested a hand on Peter's shoulder with a soft squeeze, and Peter attempted a smile back. Neither of them said anything, and Stephen didn't move away. Instead, both of them turned their attention back to the television and let the weight of their conversation disperse between them naturally. Peter didn't want to ruin the progress he'd just made, but the questions were just burning in him. There was only so long he could bite his tongue before curiosity got the better of him. Did you work with Christine at the hospital? Stephen tensed again, and Peter thought that he'd shattered their newfound allyship. He was about to take the words all back when Stephen's hand slipped away, but the man actually made himself more comfortable in the couch cushions at Peter's side. Dr. Palmer was someone I didn't appreciate enough until she was gone. I certainly didn't deserve her. That's not true, Peter was quick to answer. I mean, I don't believe that. I was stupid when I was young, Stephen maintained. I'm not sure how she put up with me at all, looking back. Well, I think you're the smartest man I've ever met next to Mr. Stark, and you're brave and loyal, and I think anybody would be really lucky to know you. Stephen glanced up at him. You really think so? Peter nodded. Absolutely. I see why Stark keeps you around. What, my endless curiosity isn't endearing? Peter failed to suppress a smile, and Dr. Strange gave him a playful whack in the arm, his grin just as wide. Peter knew he talked a lot, asked an abundance of questions. He saw the twitch in Tony's eyes when he asked too many questions at once, but he couldn't help himself. Once Pete wanted to know, he had to know. It didn't matter how many times he told his brain to stop talking. He just kept going, like his mouth had a motor of its own. So, how did you learn all of this stuff anyway? Peter wondered. I mean, Mr. Stark kind of told me, but his stories can be kind of confusing sometimes. So Stephen gave him the whole rundown. Literally, whole rundown. Stephen had originally started with his arrival at the Carmitage, but by the time Peter's curiosities were satisfied, Peter knew everything, from the accident, the last conversation Stephen had with Christine before that, to the number of emails Stephen had sent her while away, the exact placement of the pins of his hands, and the exact details of what Stephen would have done had the surgery been his to perform. As he listened to Stephen talk him through practically an entire operation from start to finish, Peter found himself awestruck. He mourned a little for Stephen and his loss, the man's passion for the job evident in the way he paused to explain every tiny, probably insignificant detail. Yeah, he and Mr. Stark were exactly alike. Peter understood why Stephen couldn't practice anymore, and he understood why Stephen had opted not to become a professor or a consultant instead. It would have been too painful to constantly be reminded of what was stolen from him, to be so close but unable to do anything. Peter would understand if Stephen couldn't bear to so much as step a foot in a hospital ever again. Peter understood the journey Stephen had made after that, why he'd been skeptical at first, why he'd taken the seemingly crazy chance not only to believe in magic, but to learn and practice it. Peter was curious if everyone had found it, like Stephen, or some were born in the knowledge. So, what about everyone else? How did Wong end up in the Carmitage? Does he have any family he left behind when he moved here to New York? Well, I know he's not married, because he didn't know who Beyoncé was. Peter was shocked. He didn't know Beyoncé. Wait, what does Beyoncé have to do with marriage? Everyone thinks they're super quirky doing the bouquet toss to single ladies, like they're the first one to come up with the idea. Seriously? Peter thought they were so tacky. Oh, yeah. How many weddings did you suffer through? 4 in a year, including my sister's. Apparently it's not polite to tell the bride on her wedding day that she's unoriginal and tasteless. I got kicked out. Okay, but you can't be blamed for that. Peter sided with Stephen 100%. I know, Stephen shrugged. Stephen was chaotic, Peter had decided. He was definitely not the mature, old-fashioned adult Peter had assumed he was. He could imagine that in his prime, Doctor Strange was probably exactly like Mr. Stark, confident, snarky, sassy, and untouchable. Traits Peter didn't otherwise care for, but somehow he found very easy to accept in slightly broken, in need of a lot of love superheroes, men he'd happily follow to the end of the world. Do you think you'd ever want to have a family? Stephen thought for a while. I don't know. I'm not opposed to the idea, but I think realistically it's not something I could ever chase. It would have to be by chance. It's never been something I've longed for, even before. Long hours as a surgeon isn't ideal for a family. I could have made time for other things, but it really wasn't about the passion anymore. I guess I started to value the reward and recognition more. If I could have worked 24/7, I would have, just for the attention. Were you rich? Not Tony Stark rich, but compared to most people, yeah. I had a nice penthouse apartment, drove a luxury car. Let me guess, Peter cut in. You had a watch collection. How did you? You still have little tan lines. Peter's fingers ghosted over his wrist. With the amount of time you spent in surgery, you must have worn one every other second of the day for it to be paled. And it's not even, which means you must have worn more than one. You got all that from my wrist? Peter nodded, and Stephen seemed impressed. They talked about Stephen's record collection. Peter hadn't expected him to know so much about music. He made Peter save at least 10 albums to a Spotify playlist to listen to later. Education, Stephen had dubbed it. He was still careful, Peter noticed, but he didn't mind. Perhaps in time, Stephen would come to trust him enough to be completely honest with him. For the meantime, Peter didn't dare wonder aloud if Stephen still owned said apartment, or record, or watches. He was pretty sure of the answers anyway. His deduction skills were getting quite the workout on Doctor Strange. What about you? Tell me about you, Stephen requested, once they'd run out of material of things to discuss about himself. There's not much to tell, Peter shrugged. I'm a kid who goes to public school and sometimes gets to hang out with Tony Stark. That's the most exciting thing about me. Do you think you'd ever want to start a family of your own? Peter thought, though not as long as Stephen had. Yeah, I don't know that I actually would, given this job, but I want to be loved, you know? It would be cool to have little kids around. Being a dad. I see the way Mr. Stark's eyes light up when he's showing me things. When I steal his glasses or MIT sweatshirt. It must be fulfilling to pass things down like that. But yeah, I don't know. Stephen looked him in the eye, soft and pleading, and suddenly it felt heavier than it did before. Peter felt weighted to whatever Stephen was about to say. I know being Spider-Man means a lot to you, but promise me you won't throw away your life for it. Go to college, fall in love, live your life outside of that suit. There's so much out there for you to see, Peter. So many beautiful cities, and the conventions and lectures. New York doesn't even touch the surface. You're so young and so smart, and you could do so many amazing things. Please, don't give it all up for this. This isn't a life. You don't deserve this. Live. Peter nodded slowly, a little overwhelmed by Stephen's sudden care for him. Okay. Promise me. I promise. I'm sorry, Stephen deflated. I didn't mean to. No, it's okay. Peter cut him off softly. It's college application time, and every time I look at them, I just get this guilt. Mr. Stark sounds so excited when he talks about it. He's even offered to write me a letter of recommendation, told me he'd get me in anywhere I want to go. But I always come back to this idea that it's selfish, that I can't do that and this, and I have to stay here to be Spider-Man and for the city. But then everyone would be so disappointed if I didn't go to college. And I want to go to college, but I also want to be Spider-Man, and it just seems so impossible. We'll figure it out. You, me, Stark. We'll find a way to make it happen, okay? Peter nodded. Okay. Stephen squeezed a reassuring hand on Peter's knee, and for a moment, those blue eyes didn't leave his. For the first time, he let Pete search. Really search. Peter frantically hunted for the lie, for any doubt or sign that the man didn't believe his own words. But true to everything Peter thought Doctor Strange was, Stephen didn't flinch. He stared right back at Peter, strong and resolute. Maybe he really could go away for college and still be Spider-Man. If anyone could find a way to make both happen, it was Doctor Strange and Mr. Stark. Peter went to Stephen's hand, but chickened out at the last minute, instead just resting atop of Stephen's wrist. Peter was too scared to touch the scars on the man's hand, in case they hurt, or it seemed too intimate for two people still in the acquaintance phase. Sometimes Peter could be a little too affectionate too quickly in the past. Stephen didn't seem to mind though, or if he did, he didn't say anything. He gave Peter a small smile, and once the air in the room felt lighter, Stephen gave him one more reassuring pat and withdrew his hand. Do you want to stay the night? The question was surprisingly soft. Okay, I should tell Aunt May though. Yes, Stephen agreed immediately. Please. Peter fished his phone out of his pocket and sent off a quick explanation to his aunt. He half wanted to text the news to Tony as well, but if the Iron Man said something to Stephen, Peter didn't want it to look like he was spying, or reporting everything back to Mr. Stark. He wanted to have a relationship with Stephen, to know him and learn from him in the same way he did from Tony. There was so much more to Stephen, and for the first time ever, Peter thought he may have a chance at unlocking that. He wasn't about to sabotage it. Stephen could teach him a different way to fight, teach him about the weak points in an opponent's body, how to disarm without the potential of mistaken murder. Peter was also more than curious about the things that Stephen wanted him to experience. He wanted Stephen to tell him more about his travels, about the places he'd worked and studied. He wanted the stories from late nights in college, grad lectures in foreign countries, where the best food was. Peter always thought about the food. Maybe one day Stephen could take him and show him. Perhaps he could portal them somewhere nice, to some nice convention, or unveiling of new technology. Mr. Stark would probably get jealous of that last one. Peter bet Tony and Stephen would bicker about it for hours afterwards, and Peter would probably spend all night in the lab with Tony to cheer him up. It sounded nice. All of it. They fell into silence for a while after Peter told Stephen that Aunt May had agreed to their sleepover. Stephen had put a new movie on a while back, just for background noise. Though now Pete had started to pay attention, he realised he actually really enjoyed it. Stephen seemed completely focused on the television too, his thumb mindlessly caressing the fabric of Levy, colour rested against Stephen's lap. It was getting a little colder, and Peter cautiously shuffled a little closer to Stephen, wrapping the tail end of Levy further over the corner of his own lap. He had hoped the move would go unnoticed, or at least the sorcerer would avoid mentioning it, but Stephen liked to know things, and Peter had no such luck. "Are you cold?" "It's okay. I'm fine. Really. Levy's great." The fire to Peter's left suddenly flared with a roar, and he felt the instant heat wave from the enlarged flames. It calmed in the next instant, but it was still larger and warmer than before. Peter had wanted to thank Stephen, but held off as the man came closer. They weren't quite sharing a single space, but Stephen's elbow nudged against Peter's, as did his knee. It was a little bit awkward, moved stiff on the sorcerer's part, but he relaxed again once he stilled. They settled back into a comfortable silence, and Peter stopped himself from curling up at the sorcerer's side. Stephen wasn't like Tony. Peter making the first move wouldn't be a comfort to the doctor. It wouldn't encourage him to open up. Pete would just have to wait until Stephen let him in, however long it took. And in the meantime, he'd just have to focus on pushing back his own affectionate nature until it was welcome. Peter was determined now to peel back all of the guards Stephen had put up to protect himself. Stephen needed some company, a friend, a little care, and Peter was sure he'd open up in no time. He'd see to it himself. About an hour later, Peter felt a thump against his right shoulder, and when he looked over to check it out, he found the dark head of hair rested against his arm. He froze for a second, sure Stephen would wake up from the impact, but he didn't. He had stirred, and Peter shushed him with soft fingers through the long locks of grey hair before he'd thought better of it. Stephen didn't push the touch away. Maybe he was too deep asleep to even notice it, but Peter felt better now he'd gotten the chance to show his care for the doctor through his love language. Stephen had taken care of him all night, talked to him about his fears, and now he had the chance to start unravelling the sorcerer's layers. Peter rested his cheek atop of Stephen's hair, and continued to stroke his fingers through the strands of hair on the one side of the man's head, until Levy suddenly rose. Peter's guard came back up in a flash, as Cloak sped out through the door and back towards the foyer. He straightened a little under Stephen, wondered if perhaps he should wake the man, though he held off for a moment. It was probably just Wong, or maybe another sorcerer. Peter wasn't sure how many of them exactly lived here. The low chuckle that rang through the building was more familiar to Peter, and he relaxed as the man made his way into the room, accompanied by Levy. Tony frowned as he set eyes on the two. Peter shook his head. "I don't know, he just fell asleep." "How long has he been out like that for?" Peter shrugged the best he could. "Couple hours? I don't want to move him. I wanted to let him sleep." Peter wasn't sure Tony was even listening anymore, too consumed in his phone as he took numerous photos of the scene in front of him. Peter felt his cheeks burn hot under the attention. He could already hear Stephen and Tony squabble over this later. "All right, I got my blackmail. Let's get him to bed." Tony made his way closer, and suddenly his whole demeanour shifted into something Peter hadn't seen before. The inventor knelt in front of them, left hand gentle on Stephen's shoulder, very delicately shaking him awake. Tony was careful, very much so, and it took Peter a moment to remember why they had all been so wary with each other. It was unwise to surprise the sorcerer, like any of them. Stephen still startled a moment, eyes slowly blinking until his body panic hit. He shot away from Peter, hand clutched into Tony's arm in defense. Tony hushed him gently, his right hand hovering over Peter, just in case he had to protect him. "Shh, shh, shh, Stephen. It's Tony. Tony and Peter." "Sorry," the doctor sighed, dropping his threatening stance as he came round. "Sorry." "You good?" Tony hesitantly dropped his guard of Peter. "Yeah. Thought you were out of the country." Stephen pushed Tony's hands off his shoulder. "Little white lie. Just came over to check how everything went, and you were passed out all over the kid." Stephen did the closest thing Peter would imagine he'd get to blushing as he cowered away. Sorry. Don't worry about it. Peter shook his head. Let's get you to bed, huh? Stephen fought Tony the entire time, but the inventor still helped pull the sorcerer from the couch. Levy led the way as the three of them started down the hall, Peter lagging a few steps behind, not keen to engage in Stephen's continuous protests. Still, Tony didn't move his hands from the man's waist, the two shuffling through the halls, until Levy pointedly tapped on a door, and then another few steps ahead for Peter. They said their brief goodbyes, Stephen failing to keep Tony's nosy butt out of his room. The sorcerer stalked after him, and after the first ow, Peter raced after Levy before the men really started to fight back and forth. He didn't want to cop a stray object in the head. With one last scratch to Levy's collar, Peter was left to his own privacy, and after a few more minutes of Tony and Stephen fighting through the wall, the sanctum fell into silence. Chapter 2. The next morning, Stephen and Peter ate cereal together, each leant against the kitchen counter. Peter wasn't sure there was anything but cereal in the cabinets, but he kept that observation to himself. He couldn't imagine Stephen cooking anyway. Actually, the thought made him uncomfortable for some reason. It was just too mundane for a Sorcerer Supreme, he decided. Not that it mattered, since Tony had sent them brunch an hour later anyway, so much food that Stephen dragged Wong up from the library to help them eat it all. Peter was starting to realise that Tony and Stephen were a lot closer than he'd known about. Tony seemed to know enough about Stephen's schedule to know when to just turn up. What his favourite restaurant had been for a warm meal after a long surgery. He knew what Stephen ordered and what he would want to eat for breakfast. There was no way Tony had guessed all of those details. For a moment, Peter's heart sunk. He felt left out. He was smart too, wanted to learn about both of these worlds. Why would Mr. Stark not call him to join them if they had regular work meetings? He would have loved to know more about the political side of the Avengers and more about Stephen's magic. He wondered suddenly if or when Tony had even left last night. Maybe Stephen had just made him a portal straight home to save any more suffering. Peter could just imagine Stephen cutting him right off mid-sentence, gone before he even knew it. Tony was adamant he would crack the secrets of the sorcerer's magic, the portals, though his science had yet to do so, and Peter knew that it gave Stephen a kick. Peter didn't dwell on it as long as he could have. Stephen was more personable that morning. He smiled more, talked a lot, let Peter listen to more sensitive work conversations with Wong. As if that didn't have Peter's heart swollen with joy already, Stephen then went on and ran a hand through Peter's hair, and he melted. He had no idea what changed overnight, but Pete already liked this more open, companionable Stephen. The Spider-Man spent the whole day at the Sanctum. Stephen showed him around, took him through a portal or two, off to the London Sanctum, and a quick visit to the Carmitage. Stephen showed Peter some of the relics, having magicked his arms stuck to his sides, a precaution after an unfortunate incident with Tony and a 1,000-year-old relic that was no longer. Peter didn't mind. Anything to convince Stephen to teach him more. He hung on every word, asked every question, eyes lapped up every detail. Peter really liked the sound of Stephen's voice, liked his presence. He hadn't wanted to leave that day, but he knew May would be halfway through prepping dinner for the two, and he couldn't leave her another night. So he reluctantly said goodbye, and very excitedly accepted the invitation to come back next week. It became quite the habit, Peter being at the Sanctum. Stephen wasn't as mature as he pretended to be, and Peter wasn't as immature as his age might suggest. They were quite compatible in their little middle. When Peter visited on an afternoon after school, he usually walked in on Stephen's meditation time. The sorcerer had insisted Pete try, and though he wasn't very good for a number of months, Peter felt like it was making a difference now. He would wordlessly stroll into the room, backpack thrown violently to the corner, and he'd sit next to Stephen's right side. Now that they were closer, Peter wasn't as shy about sitting close enough that their knees touched. Actually, it took a weight of anxiety off. Peter liked the reminder that he wasn't alone, found a lot more comfort in Stephen's company than he ever thought he would have. Stephen was different to Tony, different to May. He filled a different desire in Peter for closeness. Stephen had the ability to be a little darker. He was realistic in a less optimistic sense. When Peter unloaded heavy feelings onto him, he didn't panic or try to fix things or take Peter out of the game. Instead, he listened, offered comfort, and understood the talk was simply a release and not a cause for concern. They had movie nights. On the rare occasion, they slipped the event past Tony and didn't have Iron Man crash through the front door, very offended his invitation had been lost. Peter liked it both ways. Having Stephen to himself was nice, but having Tony there too was great as well. No matter the guest list, Peter always felt well rejuvenated with cuddles and food and long-winded rants about school, or the stupidity and lack of imagination of bad guys. When did New York criminals get so stupid? Stephen always took an interest in his schoolwork and his projects with Mr. Stark. Stephen always said he should study to be some kind of doctor or scientist, and for Peter, it was the biggest compliment ever, hearing Stephen say that he thought Peter was just as intelligent and capable as himself, that he wanted Peter to study the field that Stephen loved and took so much joy from, that he wanted to share that with Peter. Tony and Stephen often playfully fought about where and what Peter should study, each of them hoping he'd follow in their own footsteps. They were exactly the same, but different. Tony wanted Peter to have all the grand things his own life had given him. Stephen wanted Peter to have the mundane little moments that were rare and few in their heroic professions. Tony gave Peter Karen, for comfort and safety, a way for them to always be connected and less than a phone call away. Stephen gave Peter his own butterfly that manifested itself only when Peter was sad or stressed, to distract him, ground him, a direct line to Stephen should he ever need it. Tony would show him the winning move. Stephen would wait it out until Peter figured it out, and then let him win. The Iron Man would squeeze his shoulder, and the Sorcerer Supreme would pat his knee. Stephen put food on his plate. Tony stole from it. Stephen read textbooks to him. Tony enjoyed it when it was Peter who read. For all their differences, some things were exactly the same. Peter felt safe with them. They were both warm, and at the end of the bad day, all Peter could think of was sinking away into their arms. Peter was the one who started the hugging. He could tell both Tony and Stephen were holding back. Peter could have said the words flat out, "I want you to hold me," and still they'd be too cautious, so he took matters into his own hands. If Peter could go back in time and strangle both of their parents for their failures with affection, Peter would. He knew their childhoods were the reason they couldn't ask for affection the same way Peter could. He was more grateful for May now than he'd ever been before, for all the love and kindness she shared with him, and now he would share that with Tony and Stephen too. The men both worked on improvements for his Spidey suit. Dr. Strange looked good in Tony's labs, where everything had been modified to be more accessible for the sorcerer. Peter had noted the changes, though never pointed it out. He'd given Tony a knowing look that first afternoon, though, when there was touch screens in new places, and robots on hand to answer to Stephen's every whim before he even voiced them. The teen knew Tony enjoyed watching the sorcerer work just as much as he did, had caught the man turning new calculations in his head as he watched Stephen fight with his hands. Peter was pretty sure Tony had secret projects around that one day just might make Stephen's life all that bit easier. Tony really had taken a liking to the sorcerer. For all the soft looks and helping hands, the two still bickered like no tomorrow. Sometimes even Peter was begging them to shut up. It always backfired. The two would team up and annoy Peter for hours after that, but he couldn't hate it. Because being the centre of Tony and Stephen's attention was never a bad thing. They both had hyper-focus, even more so than himself. Sometimes, Peter would loan books from the library just to get Stephen to talk. He'd borrow some medical journal and have Stephen explain the specifics of a particular surgery. The man could talk for hours straight, and Peter loved to just sit there, chin rested in his hand, watching Stephen light up. Peter watched a weight fall off his shoulders. Sometimes, Stephen's fingers would absently fall into place as they should have, mimicking a surgery under them. It would have hurt, and his hands shook constantly, but Peter supposed it wasn't an easy habit to drop. It looked second nature to the sorcerer to just fall into step with the routine. Peter quite enjoyed flipping the tables on both Stephen and Tony. He liked when he gave them a release, when he got to be the one doing the caring. He liked to play adult, to reduce them both back to passionate, excitable teenagers, just fresh in the field, willing to talk the ear off anyone that would listen. He always felt a surge of pride when he managed to earn that satisfied grin afterwards, once they'd realised what Peter had done. Their eyes sparkled with affection and mischief right at him. Peter liked how warm those looks made him feel. They sent his cheeks a light shade of pink, and Peter bit back the urge to tell the men he loved them. In fact, there was nothing Peter loved more than when they were teaching him something that they loved. Back home, Peter always told May of his successes. She'd smile politely and listen to him diagnose them like a psychologist. Peter didn't really have them all figured out, though. They were messes, but they were his messes. Though Peter didn't want to admit it most of the time, he too was their mess. Peter still couldn't contain his smile when he reminisced on the time that he and Stephen had a minor misunderstanding. Peter had burst into the kitchen one afternoon, after he'd finished hanging out with Ned and MJ. He hadn't even noticed Tony was sat at the counter, barely even noticed that Stephen had tended to a meal that wasn't a bowl of cereal. "I did something really bad." Peter would never forget the way that Stephen froze, blue eyes on the kid in an instant. "It's okay. No one has to know." "What?" "Did anyone see you?" "Forget MJ's birthday. Yeah, literally every one of my friends. I don't even know how I'm going to have any of those anymore. I'm literally the worst." "That's the really bad thing that you did." "Dog." Tony had taken too much amusement in Stephen's reaction. "I thought you swore to save life, not supporting taking it." "If he had done it, you would be helping me dig the hole. We both know I wouldn't have had to ask." Stephen pointed a spatula at the businessman. Tony surrendered and agreed. "Yeah, okay. I'll dig, you deal with the witnesses." "Exactly." "What are you guys talking about?" Peter had shrieked. He absolutely hadn't meant that he had a dead body to hide, and he was horrified that that was the conclusion they jumped to. Still, behind that, it warmed his heart. To know even in the not-so-good moments, when he was stupid or in the wrong, they were still right there with him. No matter just how big the fuck-ups, they wouldn't leave. He knew he shouldn't rely on them to clean things up for him all the time, but it just felt so safe, and he trusted Stephen and Tony with anything. The day did come, not long after that, when Peter unintentionally did cause death. He lost his first civilian. His hands were bloody. He had the man's blood soaked in his suit. He shouldn't have let his nanobot armor disperse when he had. At least then he could have shed the reminder. Now, he had to stare at the evidence until they were finished and could go home. He was in shock, numb at first, while Tony cleared out the other Avengers and warned them not to talk to Peter at the compound. Peter could still barely move when they arrived back. Stephen and Tony had peeled him free of his original suit the moment they managed to drag him to the bathroom. They sat him in the tub and washed him off gently, the water stained red as it swirled down the drain. Peter just sat there, frozen, unable to help, unable to cry, unable to think. He just stared at the wall beyond them and let them towel him down until the water ran clear again. Both Stephen and Tony tried to talk to him, but Peter heard it as nothing more than muffled noise. Maybe they were talking to each other instead. It really didn't matter. He was so numb, he barely registered when Tony kissed him on the side of the head. Couldn't bring himself to care that they were both stuck in damp suits from caring for him, rubbing comforting circles against his back with a washcloth. He was completely numb. With his body clean and hair washed, they wrapped him in a towel, and after he was all dried off, and Stephen and Tony had very quickly taken turns to wash their own grime off, Stephen so kindly portaled them into the bedroom that Peter called his own whenever he slept over. He couldn't recall being dressed, nor the earlier action of his hair being brushed, teeth cleaned. He came in and out of awareness as he was laid under soft covers, and it was only when he felt the heat of two bodies close to him that he started to recognize reality. "It's okay," Tony soothed, wrapping his arms around the boy. "You can cry now." And once the tears started, they didn't stop. The sun had risen again before Peter managed to cease. His eyes stung, throat scorched, head pounded. He was exhausted, and he drifted into an empty, dreamless sleep Peter would liken to a coma. He drooled all down the front of Stephen's robes. The heat had made him sweaty and sticky, but Tony didn't seem to mind as he ran tentative fingers across his shoulders, distracted by a stark tablet in his other hand. They never talked about that day after they left that bedroom, and Peter was grateful for it. They all had a first time, and he really hoped there'd be no more to come. He wasn't sure his heart could handle it. It had come up at some point, not quite in words, that while Stephen's powers didn't necessarily need a recharge, he certainly does after wielding such high amounts. He liked to be grounded in this reality, so if Stephen came back from interdimensional travel and was crushed into a bone-breaking hug from Peter that lasted at least an hour or two, and Stephen held him back just as tightly, well, that was nobody's business. It didn't actually help Dr. Strange recover in any way, but it did make both of them feel better. Peter was also pretty sure that Stephen started to like the grey streaks in his hair more, once Peter had started to run delicate fingers through the strands, concerned pout and pulled eyebrows every time. Peter could tell when even a single one of them was new the moment Stephen walked in the door. Tony loved to tease Peter about who was the kid and who was the adult when Pete started lecturing the sorcerer about his recklessness and exhausting himself. They didn't understand his fear, though. Bad things happened to everyone that he cared about. Peter had lost every man he'd ever been close with, and his biggest fear in the world was that one day his half-assed goodbye to them one afternoon would be the last. That he wouldn't have held them tight enough or told them how much he adored the time they spent together. Peter owed everything to May, Stephen, and Tony. In their own ways, they showed him what it means to be a man, a hero, a friend. He was so grateful for May's influence and guidance. It was her kindness that now allowed him to pass on that tenderness to Stephen and Tony. He didn't care that he was the kid in their relationship. Peter liked to give back what he got, and he wanted to show Stephen and Tony what it was like to be nurtured and cared for, because it was never too late for them to get back what they missed in their own childhoods. When Stephen fell asleep on Peter on the couch any time after that first night, nor Tony or Wong, or anybody else for that matter, was allowed to wake the man. Peter knew that Stephen could count his safe spaces on one hand, and if he was comfortable enough with Pete to fall asleep, then he was going to make sure that Stephen could get all the rest he needed while he was at it. And if that embarrassing time Peter got tongue-tied and he accidentally called the man Dad instead of Doctor becomes an unexpected regularity, well, no one mentioned that either. Or the time Stephen was actually mistaken as Peter's dad at his graduation. Tony insisted later to Peter that the sorcerer had definitely cried with pride over the mistake. May had to give him 10 tissues to clean up. Though Tony ate that smugness when Peter was dropped off for his first day of college, both men insistent on being there. Peter had chosen the courses Tony and Stephen had both not so secretly been hoping he would, both far too proud to hold back the tears as they watched Peter disappear into the resident building. That was the day that Stephen and Tony each first told him that they loved him, not quickly or easily. There were 5 minutes of, "You're a good kid, we'll miss you, don't do anything stupid, if you die we'll kill you." Peter didn't mind though, nor Stephen or Tony would easily throw those words at first chance. They wouldn't be them if it was easy. They reached an agreement. Peter would return on the weekend when Stephen wasn't dimension hopping. He'd portal Peter back to New York, where he could visit Aunt May and be Spider-Man. In the meantime, he'd placed a protection charm on the Parkers' apartment, and each he and Tony promised to take care of May too. Peter was worried to leave both of them behind for the majority of the upcoming weeks. What if there was an attack? Or what if they got lonely? Who would remind them to eat and sleep? Who would they visit after a nightmare to ground themselves again? Who would pester them until they talked themselves back into exhaustion? Make them feel young again and wanted and useful? Who would hug them when they needed it? Peter's protective instincts were in overdrive, and he almost spun on his heel and abandoned the whole college thing. But when he caught Tony rest his head on Stephen's arm, just before the doors closed between them, Peter knew they'd be all right. They had each other. Peter had them. The Avengers were cool, but their little family was better. I love you, Peter whispered once more when the doors had closed. He'd already started to count the single seconds until Friday afternoon rolled round, and as he met Ned and MJ back in their dorm, they could already guess as much. Peter was grateful neither of them took offence to the blue butterfly that appeared almost instantaneously, a physical manifestation of his mourning. The hurt he felt, already knowing the distance that would come between himself and Stephen and Tony, it was like a stab wound right to the stomach. His best friend squished him in the centre of a cuddle pile for the rest of the day, a brand new Lego set on the floor in front of them ready to build. Ned talked his ear off, just the way Peter liked it, while MJ gently stroked his hair, and slowly he started to remember that he was far from alone. In fact, he couldn't have had two better people to do this alongside. They were so incredibly lucky to even be there in college. They came so close to losing it all. Stephen and Tony had paid such hefty prices to make sure Peter had these opportunities, that he and half the universe weren't lost to the blip forever. He was determined to make them proud. It was around 3 a.m. after Ned and MJ were asleep alongside the rest of the campus, when Peter felt the butterfly vanish. And finally, he could relax when he felt warm arms wrap around him from either sides. A shaky hand brushed through the front of his fringe. "You're not sleeping. Sleep," Tony muttered into the dark room. Peter grinned at the half-grumpy, half-worried tone, and snuggled further into the hold of his two favourite people in the world, grateful that they were the furthest thing he could get from normal. "You keeping tabs on me?" "We're not doing this every night," Tony warned. "You came to me, I didn't come to you," Peter reminded him. "That's because he's not as strong as you," Stephen whispered. "He misses his little spider baby." "You haven't slept a wink either, Mary Poppins. Don't pretend this is all me." "He's right, though." Stephen was talking to Peter. "We can't do this every night. Us being here defeats the purpose of you having a normal college experience." "I know. Just this once?" Peter practically begged. "Just for your first night," Stephen agreed. "Then we'll leave you alone." "You're not a burden," Peter said quickly, hands balled into the sorcerer's shirt. "I'm glad you're here." "We're glad you're here." Tony's arm tightened around him. "We're so proud of you, Peter." "I know," he grinned. "I'm proud of you too." "What for?" Stephen frowned. "For opening up to me, for saving the universe, for having a family, for being whatever the two of you are to each other. Everything." Hey there guys, gals, and non-binary pals. It's Eleanor, and I hope you're having a lovely day today. I'm having a day where I'm crying a lot because, oh my god, this fic. Jeez, the end of this? I couldn't. I literally had to take breaks recording because I was just crying so much. Like, my cheeks are still wet. Okay, this fic is so, it's so beautiful. I love this little family. I love the Supreme family. I'm like obsessed with them. I am on a bit of a Marvel kick at the moment, so you know, if you have any like Peter centric fics, particularly like Irondad or doctordad fics, send them to me. I've just been like reading so many right now. I just caught up with Dark Matter. Finally read that one. I've been putting it off because it's not completed and that stresses me out, but I decided to read it anyway, and now I'm suffering. Yeah, I'm just on a bit of a Marvel kick at the moment, so don't be surprised if you see a lot of Marvel content coming up at the moment. But let me know what you guys thought about this fic in the comments below. Did it make you very emotional? How do you feel about like seeing Stephen and Peter and like their dynamic outside of Tony as well? Because like I obviously really love this little family trope, but it's a nice one to see one more focused on Stephen's relationship with Peter. Also adorable how oblivious Peter is to the fact that they're like clearly dating, and I'm like, Peter, He's like, I wonder, like, if, like, when Stephen just sent Tony home. I'm like, you mean when Tony took Stephen back to his room and then was still there the next day? Yeah, babes. They were probably together. Don't worry about it. I love them. They're such a cute little family. And yeah, Tony was like, I have a kid, so if you're going to be my boyfriend, you're going to have to get along with my kid. Get it together. I had such a good time with this one. I'm rambling. It's been a while since I've just rambled at you, so I know some of you say you like that, some of you don't, but you know, if you don't like it, you can just not listen to the outros where I just ramble on. But yeah, you could also like the video if you liked it, and to boost my serotonin levels, you can also subscribe to be notified whenever I make new videos. I also have a Ko-Fi if you want to do that. I also have a Discord. You can join the Discord server and come and listen to my rambles even more, because I never stop talking, ever. I don't know when to shut up. That's quite unfortunate for me, but you know, really increases the watch time, the length of these videos. I'm so sorry. Some of these are so long because I'm just like talking. I don't mean to, but I go off a tangent and I just like having you guys to talk to about my life and what's been going on. What's been going on with you guys? How's your life been? It's been a bit of a mess, but it'd be like that sometimes. And it's nice being a little bit more focused on podficking again. I feel like I just like came back from the dead. But it's been fun. But I will not ramble on too much. I'll cut myself off because it's getting a bit out of hand already. So, until I see you again, be sure to practice some self-care. Yes, this is still a thing, and I'm still ready to threaten you at any given day if you have not been going to bed on time, if you're not eating your fruit and veg, brushing your teeth, and for God's sake, drink some fucking water, you nasty little prunes. Get on it, okay? And yes, this is a threat, and I will catch you guys laters.